to resuming debate, and the honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to Bill C-22, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act. Today, I'd like to focus my remarks, Mr. Speaker, on four main areas of concern that I have with the legislation that is currently drafted. However, before I begin, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a few moments to recognize the important work that is done by the men and women who serve our country's national security agencies. The work done by these agencies is paramount to the public safety of all Canadians, and I commend those who work tirelessly to keep us all safe. And like you, Mr. Speaker, and anyone else that was in this House 2 years ago on October 22nd, I have a lot of respect and admiration for those who kept us all safe that day. It could have been a different outcome, but to all of those that were here that day and kept us all safe and able to go home to our families, thank you very much to them. We are not immune to threats that our allies are facing around the world, from terrorism and homegrown radicalization. In fact, we all witnessed the tremendous work done by our national security agencies this summer when they're able to stop a potential terror attack in Strathroy, Ontario, in a community just a few hours south of my riding of Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound. And my colleague here beside me, the representative from that area, he knows that how a situation could have turned out much worse. Our security agencies were able to identify and intercept the threat from a radicalized individual before he was able to place homemade explosive devices in public locations. Without our security agencies, this could have ended in disaster. Again, thank you to those who work around the clock to keep us all safe from threats like these and all others. As I previously stated, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to highlight four main areas of concern that I have with this legislation. These areas include the timing of the legislation and appointment of the chair, the membership of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which I will refer to as the committee. And three, the level of access that the committee has to important information. And four, and lastly, the channels through which the committee releases their reports. Excuse me. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that I feel as though the timing of this legislation seems strange. The government introduced this legislation in the final days before the House rose for the summer last session. This is fine and dandy, but we found out during the summer that the Minister of Public Safety would be launching a cross-country consultation on Canada's national security framework. As part of the listed topics for discussion for this consultation, the Department of Public Safety states that accountability, prevention, threat reduction, domestic national security information sharing, passenger protect program, criminal code terrorism measures, the terrorist entry listing procedures, and more are all part of the scope of the consultation. Now, it would seem to me that there are a number of aspects of this legislation that could be significantly impacted by what is heard from Canadians as the government carries out these consultations. Furthermore, the Minister has written to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, which I am a member of, to ask that the committee also engage in cross-country consultations with Canadians on Canada's national security framework. So as the Vice Chair of this committee, I'm looking forward to travelling across Canada to hear from interested Canadians on what they think about these important topics, and they are very important. But what I'm concerned about, Mr. Speaker, is that the government once again has put the cart before the horse. I don't understand why or how it actually makes sense to anyone to table this legislation and several other pieces of legislation before this House when we have actually not yet consulted Canadians. Unless, of course, the government is just carrying out these consultations to pretend that they are actually consulting. And I certainly hope, sincerely hope that that's not the case. But, Mr. Speaker, it certainly appears that that is exactly what they're doing. Furthermore, I find it deeply concerning that the government named the chair of this committee before they had even put this legislation before the House. The member for Ottawa South was named as the chair of this committee more than 5 months before this legislation was brought before the House. Again, the cart seems to be before the horse, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, to the member from Ottawa South, I have respect for him as I do all colleagues in this House. I sat for a few years on the Transportation Committee with him. It's not about him so much as the process and some other points that I'm going to be mentioning here. I've served on many different committees since I became a member of Parliament back in 2004, and never, not once, have I joined a newly formed committee that already had a chair for months before that. The chair is always selected by the committee members through an election at the first meeting of the committee. And, you know, we all know, I'm not naive, Mr. Speaker, when the Liberals are in power or whichever party's in power, you know it's going to be one of them gets elected. But you still have the election, and that is not happening in this case. I actually find it very ironic that this government has already named the chair of this important committee, given that it was the Liberal Party during the election campaign who called and screamed for more accountability for parliamentary committees. Well, where is it, Mr. Speaker? The Liberal Party platform states that to increase in accountability, we will strengthen the role of parliamentary committee chairs, including elections by secret ballot. End of quote. Does that sound like what we're doing? Not at all. Why should the process be any different for this new committee? The chair should have never been appointed before the membership is even consulted. This leads into my second concern with the legislation as it is currently drafted. I have several concerns with how the membership of this new committee will be formed. The legislation states that the committee will be composed of the chair and up to 7 members of Parliament and up to 2 senators, and become members of the committee through a governor-in-council appointment on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. My concern here, Mr. Speaker, is that membership on the committee is at the discretion of the Prime Minister rather than Parliament. Indeed, it has been expressed by many Canadians that they want parliamentary oversight of their national security agencies. What they do not want, though, is for the Prime Minister to basically bypass Parliament and have full control of the committee. Full control, because that's the way it's designed. I think that if this committee is going to provide parliamentary oversight, then the membership of the committee should be approved by Parliament, not the Prime Minister. This committee should not have been seen as an extension of the PMO. Furthermore, excuse me. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, in reading the legislation further, I note that the bill does outline security and confidentiality guidelines for the members of the committee, with each member having to obtain and maintain a security clearance. That's all good. And they got to take an oath or solemn affirmation and comply with procedures and practices. Additionally, members are prohibited from knowingly disclosing information that was obtained in the course of exercising duties under the Act, and no member of the committee may claim immunity based on parliamentary privilege. Totally agree with that. These provisions are very important, and I am delighted to see them in the bill. However, it is very unfortunate that there is not one measure or clause that would require members that are appointed to the committee to have at least some type of former experience related to the national security environment, which I will point out that the current chair does not have any previous such experience. I find it very difficult, Mr. Speaker, to believe that this committee will be able to effectively carry out important work related to our national security agencies if this is the very first time they've ever worked in such a field. It simply doesn't add up. The reason for oversight is actual and legitimate oversight. We're not going to get that here. I don't know how someone who's still getting their feet wet on the file is able to provide proper and actual oversight. This is a significant flaw in the legislation that I hope will be addressed as we move forward on this file, on this bill. My third area of concern with this legislation relates to the level of access that the committee will have to important documents regarding the operation of Canada's national security and intelligence agencies. As the legislation is currently drafted, it is extremely limiting in regards to the information that the committee will have access to, and it entrusts a lot of power, once again, to the Prime Minister and several ministers to limit access to information for the committee when they see fit. It's totally inappropriate and absolutely unacceptable. If we want this committee to provide true, independent oversight of our national security agencies, then I think this bill will need some amending. And I hope the government's open to constructive criticism. As it stands, this bill gives the government far too much power to block the committee at every turn and to limit what they are able to investigate. This significantly limits the ability of the committee to fulfill its mandate. Again, this is supposed to be a committee of parliamentarians, not an arm of the Liberal Party of Canada. My final area of concern, Mr. Speaker, deals with the way in which the committee will report its findings to the House and, by extension, the public. The legislation is clear in stating that the committee will be required to submit annual reports on a yearly basis and special reports as required. This is great. The only problem is that these reports are given directly to the Prime Minister rather than to all of us here in Parliament. Again, that's totally unacceptable. These reports are to contain the committee's findings and recommendations, and the Prime Minister then has the ability to remove any information that he or she deems may be harmful to national security or defence before the report is tabled in the House of Commons. Essentially, the legislation gives the Prime Minister a final say on what is reported to the House. And Mr. Speaker, I know that you've sat on various committees, and that is not how it works. That's not how it's supposed to work. And but you know, under this government, it seems to be the way they want to do some things. Now, while I think that it's very important that there are checks and balances, I don't have an issue with that, to make sure that nothing in the committee reports would harm our national security. I am definitely sure that giving the Prime Minister's office a veto power over the contents of this report is the best way to go about this. That is the committee's responsibility. There's no doubt about that. As I've stated a number of times throughout my remarks here today, Mr. Speaker, this is supposed to be a committee that provides parliamentary oversight. In this regard, I think that the committee should be reporting directly to Parliament and should not have to get a stamp of approval from the PMO. Excuse me. This truly removes the ability of the committee to act independently and gives the PMO a significant amount of influence over the committee, which I find ironic since this Prime Minister promised during the campaign to decrease the role of the PMO. But I guess that was 2015 then, it's 2016 now. Having highlighted my main areas of concern that I have with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, I want to take just a few moments to highlight how the United Kingdom has formed their own committee for parliamentary oversight of their national security agencies. Now, I know that the Minister and the Chair of the committee have done some travel to do some fact-finding, but I'm not sure that the best practices from other countries have made their way into this legislation. We should learn from other countries when possible. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. I think it is important to only make comparisons between Canada and other Westminster parliaments because, as I have repeatedly stated today, this is to be a committee of parliamentarians that reports to and for Parliament. Now, this leads into the comparison that I wanted to make, Mr. Speaker. The Parliament of the United Kingdom established their Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament in 1994 to examine policy, administration, and expenditures of the Security Service, Secret Intelligence Service, and the Government Communications Headquarters. In 2013, 3 years ago, and some 19 years after their original legislation, they made very significant reforms to make this a committee of Parliament with a number of greater powers. The members of this committee are appointed by Parliament, and they report directly to Parliament. Issues of national security are reported directly to the Prime Minister. Furthermore, the members are given access to highly classified material. To me, this seems like a committee that has much more independence from the Prime Minister's office and has the appropriate level of access to classified material to truly provide proper oversight. Now, the most important fundamental difference between the committee proposed in C-22 and the committee that operates in the United Kingdom, though, is that members are appointed by and report to Parliament and Parliament alone. Again, as I have stated, if this is going to be a committee of parliamentarians that provides parliamentary oversight, then the committee should be beholden to Parliament, and again, not to the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office. So I'd be very curious, Mr. Speaker, to know that when the Minister traveled to the United Kingdom, if he was advised against making this committee an extension of the PMO, and was he encouraged to adopt the committee structure that came out of the reforms in the United Kingdom in 2013. The reason that this is a key point, Mr. Speaker, is that we're just getting, we've been a little bit away from the kind of some of the hot spots in the Middle East and where terrorism seemed to blossom. But England and Britain seen this a lot quicker than we did. So their legislation has been been there for some time. And of course, the longer you have a piece of legislation in place, no matter what it has to deal with, you learn stuff from it. I don't care how smart any of us are or any government is in this House. Every bill that we draft, I think we'd be wrong in saying that every bill is perfect, because that's not the case. And as things evolve and change, you adapt with that and make changes, which is what the Brits did in 2013. The other bill seemed to be very similar to what this government is putting in place today, and they realized after 19 years or 17 years, whatever it turned out to be there, that it wasn't doing the job, it wasn't right. So they have changed it to make it right, and we should have followed those changes, and it's obvious that we didn't. The parliaments of Australia and New Zealand also have committees of Parliament that provide oversight over their national security agencies, though they are much different than what is being proposed by Bill C-22. The United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, offers the closest comparison to C-22. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we should learn from the experience of the United Kingdom. They have had some form of parliamentary oversight, as I said, since 1994. Clearly, the reforms that were made back in 2013 were brought about for a reason. We should do to the greatest extent possible, offer a similar model, as I said, that reflects the lessons learned in the UK from having such a body in place for more than 20 years now. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I do hope that the Minister and his department consulted all of the current oversight agencies when drafting this legislation to ensure that there will not be a duplication of work, or that this committee, that the committee should respect the agencies already in place and work alongside them in providing parliamentary oversight. Now, I look forward to hearing from oversight agencies such as the Office of the Communications Security Establishment Commissioner, Civilian Review and Complaints Commissioner of the RCMP, and the Security Intelligence Review Committee on this legislation. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the rest of the debate that's going to take here today and in the coming weeks and months, and look forward to taking some questions from my honourable colleagues. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Councillor Commentaire, the honourable member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague from Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound for what I thought was a very thoughtful and engaging presentation to the House on his thoughts on Bill C-22. And I've listened carefully to the comments from the official opposition over the course of the debate so far. And I do want to say that I'm heartened here on the government side that there seems to be a change of heart now that the official opposition now sits on the opposition benches, but not too long ago was the government and was at that time not as receptive to the basic content of now what is being proposed in Bill C-22. Now, my friend laid out, I think, 4 broad criticisms, and to me it seems primarily related to issues of process. And I'm only going to just dig into one of them, and that namely was with respect to membership in the committee. And he had indicated that it was his view that the members of this particular parliamentary review committee should have a background in security. But I would argue perhaps that what's most important is that the members be independent and have an open mind with respect to challenging the positions that are advanced by the government, as opposed to, and not necessarily be captured by the particular perspectives of, for example, if they had previously served in a security agency or with the police, by their particular perspectives. Does my friend have a particular thought or would be willing to reconsider who ought to sit on that particular committee?
The honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague on the other side and welcome him to this very prestigious place, and thank him for his question. But just 2 points that I do want to point out, Mr. Speaker. Not once did I or anyone from this side, to my recollection, say that we shouldn't have this kind of oversight or committee, with our security intelligence agencies. But it was, again, the process. Way back when the minister announced there was going to be a committee, and before that committee was even formed, he tells us who the chair is. And so it was, again, not about not supporting this kind of a committee. It never was about that, and never will be. Again, it's that process. And I found the members' questions, if I was, a police officer or somebody out there that's had some background in intelligence and security, I think I would have taken his comment there. He was basically implying that somebody out there, it would be better off not to have somebody with experience from the security side or the policing side. And I don't think that they would agree with that.
Question and commentaire.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He mentioned a lot of shortcomings in C-22 in his speech. For example, the fact that the chair would be appointed rather than elected by his peers to this parliamentary committee. Also, the fact that the chair of the committee would actually have to report to the Prime Minister directly because the Prime Minister would appoint him. And the fact that there is limited access to certain information compared to some other monitoring agencies. And that the Prime Minister would ultimately be able to decide whether he would accept or reject certain parts of a report that were to be tabled before Parliament. This is sort of as though the Prime Minister were telling a parliamentary committee that he would have the final say over their reports. My colleague knows how things work on parliamentary committees, so I'd like to ask him, does he think that it's even conceivable that the Prime Minister should have such power over a report to be tabled in Parliament? What kind of message does my colleague think that sends about the Prime Minister's relationship with this House?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you, thank the member for a great question and a dead-on observation. Of course, this is, giving lip service is all that this is doing. The committee is just a figurehead, so to speak. The Prime Minister, in his instructions to the Minister, obviously has told the Minister, draft this legislation, so basically I have final say. And, I can dwell and talk about that for another hour, but I know I don't have that time. The bottom line is the member who just asked the question, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right. This is, the committee just turns out to be a figurehead. They'll go through the due process, but at the end of the day, it won't matter one iota.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that last statement by the member was just absolutely ridiculous. This committee is not an extension of the Prime Minister's office, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is somebody has to name this committee. The committee is made up of the chair plus 8 members. 4 of them are from the government side. Is the member telling us in this House that those 5 members, including which includes 2 senators, that they don't have the ability to challenge the Prime Minister? They're on that committee. There is security matters that had to be in relation to our colleagues around the world that a government has to take responsibility for, Mr. Speaker. And so the Prime Minister has to be a check and balance. But if the committee doesn't agree that the Prime Minister should have restricted an item, then they would naturally report it to the House, and the Prime Minister would face some heat for that. And so the Prime Minister would have to be very reluctant to veto what is in that report. There has to be checks and balances, Mr. Speaker. We do need this oversight committee, and I have faith in parliamentarians that are on that committee, would be appointed to that committee, that they would do their job in terms of that balance of safety and security.
Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, Mr. Speaker, once again, the red face and the thrust from the member from Malpeque, I've seen it for years. And it isn't, in all due respect to the member, it isn't that I doubt that the parliamentarians on that committee will do their job. But at the end of the day, if the Prime Minister doesn't agree with them, he'll veto it. And, the member and I, we both sat on the Agriculture Committee for years, and the member quite often displayed to me how at the end of the day it didn't, when he was to dealing with agriculture all the time in the government, that most of the time it didn't matter because he was overruled anyway. So it should come as no surprise to him. I doubt this government's any different from the last one that he served in. And at the end of the day, the PMO is going to decide what direction that committee takes, not the parliamentarians.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Through you, I'd like to congratulate my friend from great Bruce-Owen Sound for his good work on this file. Maybe I'd like to get my friend, through you, Speaker, to talk about the level of hypocrisy we're seeing on the other side of the House now. The Liberal Party, when they were in opposition, they yelled and screamed, jump up and down, and oh my goodness, the world is ending. The PMO has too much power, and what do they do right now? Power to the PMO, veto power, appointed a chair to a committee that hasn't been started yet. How, my friend, through you, Chair, maybe he can explain, maybe make some sense out of this, because I can't.
Honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, a new colleague in this House relatively, and one I've gained a lot of respect for, and a great question. But I'm, to him, I'm not going to pretend to figure out how a Liberal mind works, but at the same time, I'm not going to be naive enough to try and tell them that, hey, it'll get better. It won't get better. The Prime Minister and the PMO is going to have final say on whatever comes out of this committee's work. And it should be a good committee, and it has the ability to be. But because of those restrictions, at the end of the day, Canadians and parliamentarians, I think, are going to be very, very disappointed if they just take the time, swallow the pill, and make the same kind of changes that the Brits just did in 2013 and make this the bill that it should be.
Resuming debate.